In ancient Rome, Emperor Nero hunts Christians. In prison, the Apostle John sees the apocalypse. In Jerusalem, Jews revolt in all-out war. For them, it's the end of the world. One Christian woman holds the key to a war of angels and demons that will change the future forever. Chronicles of the Apocalypse is a series of biblical novels by best-selling author Brian Godawa, telling the story of the book of Revelation in the 1st century. 4 supernatural novels. Read them all, from Tyrant, Rise of the Beast, to Judgment, Wrath of the Lamb. Available in ebook, paperbook, and audiobook at Amazon.com. That's Chronicles of the Apocalypse by Brian Godawa at Amazon.com.
Okay, let me switch the view here. Gallery view. There we go. Guys, welcome to Through the Black. We got Brian Godawa back again. So, surprise, no one else is showing up to teach on the preterist viewpoint of Daniel. It's just me and Brian still. Shouldn't be a surprise. If you've watched the first 2 episodes of Daniel, we did Daniel 2, then we did Daniel 7. Now we're moving into Daniel 8, so welcome. And yeah, Brian's going to fill us in on what we talked about last time. We're going to jump right into the middle of it. Brian, go ahead.
Absolutely. Well, today we're going to talk about Daniel 8 and how basically these the Medo-Persian and Greek kingdoms are embodied in what is it? We're now the 3rd vision that we're up to. Yeah, Daniel's 3rd vision. But before we do, let's do the recap that we started. We said that we've been focusing basically on the visions of Daniel, the 5 visions of Daniel, and we're going to avoid some of the other material like the lion's den and stuff like that, so that we could stick to the prophecy, because there's enough to talk about that. And also in because we wanted to make this sort of a preterist, provide a preterist commentary, so to speak, right? And we are using I'm heavily relying on J. Rogers' book, In the Days of These Kings, a preterist commentary on Daniel, and as well as
Amazon finally delivered it to my door, dude. And
finally.
I have it. This is what it looks like for anybody that wants to order a copy of The Days of the Kings, all 700 pages of this monster.
As well as some writings of Ken Gentry out of his Revelation commentary, and he also wrote on Daniel 9, and drawing from some other authors as well. But I am relying heavily on Jay, and he's been a real good help. So we recommend that book definitely. And if you so we talked about Daniel 2 and how that was the first introduction to the metal man statue, which was about the 4 kingdoms that were coming, and that's the times of the Gentiles, which means these prophecies are all about how the Gentile kingdoms ruling over Israel in particular. So it's not interested in just generic history of kingdoms, but specifically the kingdoms who were ruling over Israel. And of course, they are a result of God's punishment for the disobedience of Israel, not obeying Yahweh, right? So it has a very specific Israel focused context. And we saw how that there's a lot of, and we're going to see more today, there's a lot of prophetic symbolism that is used repetitively throughout, and many times symbolically, the same kinds of images or language is used of different fulfillments, so that we need to be careful to understand it in its context and not say, oh, there's a little horn here, so it's got to be the same as the little horn over here. No, not so. So we talked about that complexity of prophetic symbolism, but also how there's a lot of recapitulation in Daniel, and Daniel covers a lot of time. He starts out quite young and he ends up 90 years old or so. And so these visions cover a long time period. And so we started with those 4 kingdoms, and then we saw how there's a repetition of that in Daniel 7, with the various monster beasts And then it went into what happens. It focused on the last beast, the iron beast, which is ancient Rome. Why? Because that's when Messiah, the king, the stone carved without hands, the Messianic kingdom would come in the days of the ancient Roman Empire. And it would actually, the kingdom of God would then be begun, right? And it would be instituted because Messiah would have come. And so that's the context of all of these prophecies. The whole focus of Daniel is the coming of Messiah. And we go through most of these chapters. And then we talked about the little horn and some of those events, and how in Daniel 7, the ascension of the Son of Man to the throne of God was the ascension of Jesus. Jesus is that Son of Man. He ascended to that throne, and also he came on the clouds in judgment to Jerusalem, and he used Nero as the little horn, who was the persecutor of the body of Christ, and how God used and manipulated all those evil monsters to accomplish his ultimate plan of bringing about his kingdom. So, and this is all tied into, like I say, it's all tied into the promises to Israel and how Israel would repeatedly disobey God until the point where God would actually do a dramatic change and bring a new covenant, right? So I think there was something else I wanted to say about that, but I forgot. I remember I'm radioactive. Shake. Just kidding. So now we're coming on to Daniel 8, and we're seeing that this is in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. And this is around 539 BC. Daniel is now about 70 years old. So he's a lot older now. And this is a critical sort of turning point in a way. This is not going to be as controversial as all the other passages we're studying. There's mostly an agreement upon these kingdoms here, which is going to be talking about the Medo-Persian kingdom and how it's overcome by the Greek kingdom, and ultimately it's going to point to Antiochus Epiphanes, who was crucial in the history of Israel in the distant future for them.
Do you find that these chapters that are less controversial, like the ones that are less controversial, are usually the chapters where there's an angel that explicitly reveals what the vision means, right? Because this is one of those chapters where at the end, the angel says, I'm going to show you what these things mean, and spells it out. Do you find that that's something that kind of like makes it more difficult for people to futurize?
I don't know. I don't think so, because I think that we have seen there's going to be more of this, and there will be explanations by angels over issues that people disagree on. And in fact, one of the big arguments for some futurists that I know is that they say Revelation, how do you know what's symbolic and what's figurative? Everything that an angel or Jesus or whoever gives an explanation that this is a symbol, those are symbols, and everything that doesn't is literal. And the problem with that is I found like 20 or 30 images and symbols that are used in Revelation that are not announced as symbols, that are not explained as a symbol to the reader or to John. So that obviously just doesn't hold. And a lot of futurists are the ones who seek to hold to that because they want everything to be literal and as much as possible, right? So they cling to that sort of paradigm that ends up blinding them to the poetic language that is clear to anyone who studies, the ancient world and particularly ancient prophecy, So I actually think I was wrong on that date. The date's actually around 553 BC, the 3rd year of Belshazzar. And the events that would come to pass would be in 539 BC when Babylon is conquered by the Persians. We'll see how that works out. So this is the 3rd vision. Remember, the empires in order: Babylon, followed by Medo-Persian Empire, followed by Alexander the Greek and his invasions, and then his kingdom is broken up. We'll see that. So it starts in the 3rd year of reign of King Belshazzar. A vision appeared to me, Daniel. I saw in the vision when I was in Susa, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision, I was at the Ulai Canal. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had two horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. And as I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between its eyes. He came to the ram with the two horns, which I had been standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him with powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, and he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the hosts and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offerings was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression, and it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, these holy ones are, of course, the watchers, the angelic beings. For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. And then the second half of the chapter is when Daniel does have the angel Gabriel explains some of these elements to him. And we'll refer to those when we start walking through the passage. It says, when Daniel, I had seen a vision, sought to understand it. Behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man, heard the man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood. When he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. Give me a second. I have to open my door.
Okay, no worries, man. No worries. We'll just all.
Sorry about that.
You're all right.
It's getting hot in here. So I think what I'll do is I actually will read through this because I think before we start looking at the actual elements, now we're into the part where it's being explained. So first of all, you have this man appearing, and I mean, I'm not going to go into detail, but Michael Heiser talks about this in his book Angels, which I recommend. Talks about Gabriel and Michael in the book of Daniel, and this other figure, this other man that keeps appearing, and ultimately argues that it is the angel of the Lord, which is a pre-incarnate presence of Christ, right? So I think Christ is telling Gabriel here, tell him the meaning, right? And so he says, I understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. Now, this is a phrase that we're going to see come up a lot, particularly in this passage, but also near the end in chapter 12. And in verse 18, it says, in verse 19, behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end, right? And then, like I said, this phrase, time of the end. And so this is where a lot of futurists will say, aha, see, this is the time of the end. So this stuff happens at the end of time, at the end of history. No, it does not, actually. In fact, this is one of those passages that will help us to understand that the context of biblical language, prophetic language in particular, we have to understand context and not impose upon it our personal, we read the time of the end and we think, oh, that's the end of history that hasn't happened yet. But it's like, no, no, no. So for instance, we've talked about this before when Jesus said, the last days of what? The time of the end of what, right? It's not the end of all history. And contextually, he kind of explains it down in 8:19, the latter end, or the end of the indignation. And that's an interesting phrase that's going to come up again in Daniel chapter 9, which refers to something that I think clearly says that this is about the time of the arrival of Messiah and the end of the indignation, which is the sin of Israel rejecting God, right? Excuse me. Particularly, this is God's judgment. The indignation is God's judgment for the Jewish apostasy embodied in the exile. And I'm just going to jump ahead now just to make that point. We'll see in the next, when we talk about it, but its context begins here. Daniel 9, 5 through 12. Daniel is, again, he's praying before God, contemplating Jeremiah. And he says, we have sinned. He's praying to God. We have sinned and done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, we, Israel, turning aside from God's commandments and rules, turning aside from your commandments, O God. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets, who spoke in the name of our kings. To you, Lord, belongs righteousness, but to us open shame. As at this day, the men of Judah, to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to all Israel, those who are near, those who are far, in all the lands, to us, O Lord, belongs open shame. To our kings, our princes, etc., to the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, for we have rebelled against him. We have not obeyed the voice of our Lord. I'm going to finish it up over there. He has confirmed his words, which he spoke against us, against our rulers, by bringing upon us a great calamity. So this calamity, this indignation is the consequence of Israel disobeying God over and over and over again. And I also would say that this would be when the end is when Messiah would come. All right. So
can I add a verse to that? I mean, I know we're not just trying to jump ahead, but yeah, even in 10, even in chapter 10, you see that context, because in verse 14, chapter 10, verse 14, he says, and came to, I'm just jumping through, and he came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision is for days yet to come. The whole concept of the end is tied to the end of his people, not us or people 2,000 years from now. It was his people.
And I think in specifically the end of the indignation, because here's what it is. So the indignation is the exile, which is the judgment on God for this. Let me see here, 5. Okay, here we go. It's the indignation of the sanctuary, right? Because in 8:19 he says, I'll make known to you the latter end of the indignation refers to the appointed time of the end. And then Daniel 8:13, he says, okay, here it is. This is where this is actually in our chapter, and we read it already. I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said, how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate? So this is a phrase we're going to see a lot, the abomination that causes desolation, the transgression that makes desolate, the indignation, and the giving over the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. So that's what the indignation is a part of. It's this judgment upon them. And particularly, the transgression on the temple there. So this is not the end of time. It's the time of the end. The end of what? The end of the indignation, which is God's judgment. Now there's, just to make a point here, different phrases used for the same event throughout Daniel 8:11. Let's see. Transgression makes desolate. Okay, I've pretty much already talked about that, so that's fine. Oh, okay. This is kind of interesting. So just to show too that even the phrase "the end" is contextually determined. It doesn't mean the same thing in every prophecy or passage. And let me explain. So here, the end is 817. It's when Antiochus Epiphanes and the abomination of desolation of the temple, it's the end of the temple, right? In Daniel 11:27, he talks about the end, but we're going to see as we go through that that's the end of the Maccabean conflict with Epiphanes. So he says, the wise shall stumble until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. But in context, we're going to see that that's a reference to the Maccabean conflict with with Epiphanes. And then in Daniel 11:40, the same phrase is used of yet another concept, which is what you brought up, which is the end of the covenant people. So if you get my point, what I'm saying here, the end, you really have to ask in context, the end of what? So I just wanted to set that up as we
and none of the context in Daniel seems to point to the end of all things.
Of history, right? A end of history as we contemplate it.
Exactly. Every time it references the end in Daniel, it never in context is referencing the end of all things. So
yeah, exactly. So and just to give you a historical context here, which I thought was kind of interesting. So Belshazzar is this king who reigns from about 555 to about 539. And these events occur, and by the way, G. Rogers writes all about this historical stuff, which is very helpful. The following order of events came to pass in 539 when Babylon was conquered by the Persians. And we have secular authors as well, historians that support all this. So first of all, King Cyrus of Persia is defeated Nabonidus of Babylon in a battle outside the city. So Nabonidus surrendered and Cyrus spared his life. Cyrus is the king of Persia. Then the Persians moved and besieged Babylon, which was still under the control of King Belshazzar. And then Belshazzar, thinking he was safe behind the Babylonian walls, right? He didn't mount a defense. He thought he'd be safe. Instead, he was feasting and drinking with 120 of his satraps. And what happened was, this is a famous battle kind of event. The Persians diverted the Euphrates River because the Euphrates River flows through the city of Babylon. And when they diverted the river so that it would dry up and the water level dropped, and that allowed them to wade in through under the gates of the river, see? And that's how they took the city. And so it was taken without much of a fight, and Belshazzar was actually slain in the surprise attack. So that's what happened historically. Now let's take a look, and there's more historical things we'll see, but let's keep moving. We'll take a look at how these things were fulfilled. Now, the first thing is this ram. We see this ram standing on the, oops. Oh, I hate these notes the way they don't always work. The ram is Medo-Persia. Now, we've talked about this before. Medo-Persia was the second metal on the huge man statue, right? It was the silver, I guess. And we talked about how in Daniel, Medo-Persia, that was always referred to as the Medes and the Persians, which was a double kingdom, even though technically when Cyrus was reigning, he was reigning over, Persia. But he was dominant. Cyrus the Great was dominant, right? But it's still, in Daniel 7, we read about the bear and how the bear was Medo-Persia. So now we have this ram with two horns. And the two horns kind of represent what we have already seen, which is this sort of dual reigning of Media and Persia, even though Cyrus is stronger. And that's why it says the ram had two horns. Both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. So in other words, it began with the Media in control, and then ultimately Persia became in control with Cyrus. See, so that's how that's referring to history. Daniel is living in the time of Cyrus while he's conducting these campaigns. So another thing too about those horns, we've seen that horns can mean either kings, because sometimes they're described as a king like the little horn, or sometimes the horns are kingdoms. We saw in Daniel 7 where they're also described as kingdoms. So in this sense, the Medes are one horn, the Persians are another horn, or you could really see them as kings. Maybe that bigger horn is Cyrus and the smaller horn is King Belshazzar of the Medes, right? So who knows? But I'm sorry, was that Belshazzar or? Yeah. So we got the two horns.
What were you just thinking?
Oh, I was, I'm just making sure I'm not mixing up the history references.
Okay.
Belshazzar.
That's the thing, right? Like even as I'm going through this with you, it's like I'm even like reading Jay's book. I have a lot less to say reading Daniel because there's so much history, man. I just want to, if anybody is really pushing their way through this preterist perspective and trying to learn, it kind of feels a little overwhelming for me as a newbie to studying Daniel, because I'm like, how am I going to remember all of this stuff? There's so many kings and kingdoms and so many things in history that seem to matter. I feel really sympathetic for people that are coming out of dispensationalism, trying to understand this. And I can see why it might be easier just to like go back to what's easy, because this isn't easy. It's not easy, so
yeah. Oh, and it gets harder. Chapter 11 is like a mess to me, but it is relevant. If we remember the context, which is, this isn't just about telling future history. This is like, these events, here are the events that are going to occur in these Gentile kingdoms that are relevant to ultimately leading to of kingdoms who are over Israel and how they affect Israel. Because why? Because Israel is God's chosen people, right? So he sees the ram charging westward. Let me see if there's one other thing. So if we look down when he starts to explain it, let's see if he gives us any other information that might be helpful. We talked about how the time of the end, we see in verse 20. Yeah, I should have jumped down there, because this was an example where he literally tells us, as for the ram you saw, the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia, right? Yeah. So I was talking about it as kingdoms. But again, I accept that it could be both and, but here it's specifically saying the kings of Media and Persia. So that's obviously then Cyrus and Belshazzar. But then he says, and the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. So if we move back up to the next thing, the goat, we see that the ram charges westward, northward, and southward. That's a description of the Persians basically conquering, all the land. No beast could stand before him. This is the great power of Cyrus. But before we get to the goat, I just want to, there's an interesting thing that says he did as he pleased. This is an interesting phrase that is going to show up multiple places in Daniel. Another way of saying it is he did as he wills. And these are phrases that are going to be used of mighty kings who are very powerful and even godlike, or at least consider themselves godlike, right? So in this chapter, it's talking about Cyrus. Cyrus does as he pleases. He thinks of himself as a god. Later on in this passage, we're going to see the same phrase used of Alexander the Great. I'm sorry, not later in this passage. In Daniel 11:3, it says, then a mighty king shall arise who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. It's this way of sort of saying like they think they're gods and they can do whatever they like. They do as they will. They do as they please, right? Daniel 11:16 talks about Antiochus the Great, who he's one of the first Seleucid rulers after Alexander, and it calls him, it says, but he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him. These great and mighty power. Then Antiochus the Fourth, Epiphanes, in Daniel 11:28 is also described as he shall work his will and return to his own land. And then in Daniel 11:36, it talks about a character who I think is Titus. Some say it might be Herod or the Caesars, but it says the king shall do as he wills. We'll talk about that when we get there. But you see, my point here is that all these kings that rise up in these kingdoms, or not all, but many of these kings, they think of themselves as gods, and they think of them, and because they're over the people of Israel, it's this very blasphemous sort of self-view. And remember how the little horn back in in Daniel 7 talked about he proclaimed boastful words, or in other passages it says blasphemous words, words of blasphemy in Revelation 13, right? That little horn saying words of boasting. It's this concept that we're talking about here, that all these godless kingdoms who stand against God, they are depicted humbled. We'll see that on each of them. They'll be humbled by God eventually. But it's just this phrase, he will do as he wills. And this is another one of those phrases that you have to be careful. Just because it uses the same phrase, a king does as he wills, a king does as he wills, doesn't mean it's the same king. In fact, very much not, because there's concepts. And by the way, this doesn't mean that there's a repetitious a double fulfillment, or that it's a prophecy that gets fulfilled over and over in many different kings. That's not what it is. It's simply a phraseology that is common to the same kind of godless kings. Same kind of godless kings are going to also behave very similarly. They're going to be blasphemous. They're going to be proud, right? Because they're conquering the world and they think they're gods. So this is a common thing in prophecy, repetition of concepts. Verse 5, as I was considered, behold, a male goat came from the west. Okay, so across the face of the whole earth, not touching the ground, conspicuous horn between his eyes. So the angel down here in verse 21 does tell us, okay, this is king of Greece. All right, we know in history that Greece took over, it conquered. I don't know if you hear that noise or not, but I hate that. Oh, that's backing up. That's backing up. Let me stop my backup.
I do not hear it, so.
Oh, good. Well, I do, so it's enough for me to stop it. Okay, so where was I? Oh, okay. So it says that the goat is the king of Greece, and we know in history that the Alexander the Great conquered the Persians, and it says, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. The first king is Alexander the Great. As for the horn that was broken, wait a minute. Yeah. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others rose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. What does that mean? Well, going back up here, we read in the actual description of the passage, it says, came with a ram, a conspicuous horn between his eyes, and that is Alexander. He came to the ram with 2 horns, ran at him, destroyed him, just like Alexander did, and cast him down on the ground and trampled on him. There's that phraseology again, that trampling. When you've got a powerful kingdom that subdues, trampling is a common phrase. And the goat became exceedingly great. Alexander became great, Alexander the Great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And if you know history, you know that Alexander died at the height of his conquering of the world. He was conquering the world. He would have conquered the whole known world unlike anybody, but he died young. He reigned from 336 to about 323 BC. I can't remember how old he was. I forgot to put that note down. I think it was like in his 20s or something like that. I mean, he was really young.
29,
so,
I think.
And so he actually, what's that?
I think he was like 29.
What'd you say?
I think he was
okay,
like.
yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Do some Googling. Google
there's
for
a
me.
delay. There's a delay all of a sudden. So sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Okay, so he's 29 and yeah, and he was in the middle, and he was like, find out where he died. I think it was in Babylon, actually. He died of some disease, you know. So he got sick and died. So at the height of his power, he dies, just like this great horn is broken. And it says, instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of the heaven. What does that mean? Well, in history, what happened was Alexander was in the process of dying, on his deathbed or whatever, and he split up his kingdom between 4 generals. And they were Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander. Now, these 4 will become very relevant in Daniel 11, a couple of chapters later. And we're going to go into more detail in those kingdoms. But at this point, the only thing to know is that these 4 military leaders then took over, and the kingdom was split up, but they became rivals with each other as well. So, and we're going to see that. But in particular, the next verse 9, it says, out of one of them. So the 4 conspicuous horns, if we go down later in the passage, it says, 22, as for horn that was broken, in place of which 4 others rose, 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. So these were just his military generals, and they didn't have the same power that Alexander had, right? And they ended up, like I said, being a very divided.
32. Says he was 32. Died in Babylon.
32. Thank you for that correction. What did he die of? Does it say?
They don't know. He was 12. It says this History Channel documentary article said he died after 12 days of excruciating pain, and they're thinking about typhoid fever and malaria and all kinds of other possibilities. Nobody knows.
Yeah. So, but then what happens is now in verse 9, out of one of these 4 horns comes a little horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the glorious land. The glorious land is a phrase that is used of Israel. Now, this is talking about the Seleucid kingdom. And this is going to be the kingdom out of which ultimately Antiochus Epiphanes comes, and he's the one who is the abomination of desolation later on. Or actually, we're gonna see him here too. But my point is that this is the kingdom that becomes specifically relevant to Israel because it ends up taking over Israel. And what happens is the Seleucid kingdom went down and conquered Egypt, and then came back up and also, just devastated Jerusalem and Israel. And you can find out, you can read about, and I highly recommend people do this. Read the book First Maccabees. It tells the story of, and if you read it, by the way, it almost reads like it's answering Daniel and saying, this is, the language that it used to describe the events, even the very first chapters that you read, how can I say here? After Alexander dies, and it says he fell sick, summoned his officers, then came forth a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes. And it says, he ends up becoming this sinful root, and he does all these things. And the language of First Maccabees, you can see how it fulfills Daniel. And it's a very interesting story because it's not in the Bible. Maccabees comes from one of the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha, at least in Protestant, it's considered part of the Old Testament in the Septuagint, and the Roman Catholic Church accepts it as part of the canon. Protestants don't accept it as part of the canon, but Protestants who have knowledge of the history of scriptures and literature do accord it historical value. They just don't think it's scripture and doesn't have the same authority as God. So this talks about a time of fulfillment events that is not considered scripture, but it's considered basically true. And so it tells that story about Antiochus Epiphanes, how he comes, and actually it's kind of interesting. So this is when Hellenism started, and Hellenism would be the Jews who adopt Greek thinking, and it alters the way they live out their faith, and they become very influential in the New Testament period. And when we read about Jesus and about the Book of Acts and stuff, the Hellenistic Jews are very important. They were the compromisers, so to speak, with the Greek. By that time, it's Rome was in power, but its origins can't come in Greece, and this is when it occurred, because what happened was Antiochus Epiphanes, he's Antiochus IV. So, by the way, Alexander dies, and it's not for what is it, 100 and how many years? So 323 to about 175. So that's 150, 60 years. It's not till then that Antiochus Epiphanes rises up. So this horn is, over 150 years later than Alexander. Now, but he comes out of that Seleucid kingdom, which was founded by Seleucus, one of the 4 generals of Alexander. So you can see how there is still a continuous history, basically, even though there might be a jump of some years, it's still I want to stress that Daniel does tend to not add big gaps. It tends to show the flow of history, at least from a higher angle, So because a lot of futurists seek to throw in thousands of years gaps where there aren't any, and this might be one of the places where they might appeal to it. Oh, there's a gap of 135 years or whatever it is, right? And to which you would say, or I'm sorry, 160 years or so, to which you say, well, actually, though, not really, because he is part of the Seleucid kingdom, which happened right after Alexander died. So he's part of that Seleucid kingdom, which was right after. But Daniel's focusing on only the specific kings that are related to the prophecies he wants to talk about. So he's not going to talk about every king. So obviously there's going to be jumps there.
Were you just referencing the futurist attempt usually to throw in a 2,000 year gap between the 69th and 70th week?
Yes. Now we've already been seeing, they tried to throw a gap in Daniel 2 at the ancient Roman Empire, right? So, it's a revived Roman Empire. They're going to throw some gaps in Daniel 9. So they keep adding gaps because of their preconceived theology or eschatology, but there's no indication that there is a gap in the text itself. It's something they have to add.
It has to be added to make their worldview work.
Right. But I just want to point out that consistently throughout, we see Daniel's prophecies are more organic and chronological. Yeah, it may jump some years, but they're still basically one after the other.
Still chronological. There's a reason.
Yeah. And they're still connected kingdom-wise. So in other words, remember, the kingdoms are the ones that are in the same order, but you're not focusing on every king. But you're still focusing on the kings within that next chronological kingdom. Yeah, I hope I'm not belaboring it too much.
No,
like you said,
because what you're doing is you're giving the context that allows people to understand what he's saying. There's a way to read this. If there are gaps, it's not that important. It's the chronological order that's important. And if you have a worldview where gaps are important, you might focus on the gaps, but really people should be focusing on the order and chronology.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, I agree. Daniel is so complex. So I hope that my sort of in-depth repetition sort of helps cement things and brings it home, Now, Rogers does this interesting thing where he talks about this little horn. Oh, I'm sorry. No, that's in Daniel 7. So I won't talk about that. But most commentators actually still, like I said, this is not very controversial, this chapter. Most people would agree about, most evangelicals even would agree with most of this interpretation that I'm familiar with. Maybe they might jump ahead. I don't know all of them, so they might have some jumps in there, but basically they're still in the same ballpark right now as far as what we're talking about now. Because little horn in verse 9.
Even the evangelical, the futurists, believe that a lot of Daniel's prophecy has come to pass. It's just because they have a futurist worldview, they've added a gap and they've stretched the final Roman Empire out like 2,500 years. That's really only where the views really seem to diverge, right? Is that instead of looking at this coming to a conclusion, we've stretched it out, saying it hasn't ended yet, right? But everything below, everything above the feet, pretty much, that they say, oh yeah, we all agree, we're in pretty much agreement as to what these are.
Yeah, exactly. So, and on the counter side of that, the liberal side, it's also relevant here because the liberal side believes that, Daniel is a fake book that was written after the Maccabees revolt, which took place under Antiochus Epiphanes, which is who we're talking about, the little horn, right? So that they were using it to justify as if it was prophecy, right? They call it ex eventua, after the event, right? And the liberal says that, therefore, liberals tend to view that this whole thing is all about leading up to Antiochus Epiphanes. So they'll even think Antiochus Epiphanes is in Daniel 12, right? It ends with him. At most, they might say, the author tries to extend a little bit beyond Antiochus Epiphanes but he ends up being wrong, right? So that's how liberals do this. So that's why they see, the little horn, it's Antiochus Epiphanes is the major thrust in most of these prophecies, and it's pointing to him, right? So they have it, equally wrong, as do the futurists. So yeah, so liberals would be bad preterists. Everything was in the past, and even the prophecy itself was written after the events occurred. So we're here. We're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. So one of the things that happens is, so Epiphanes takes over, and he's a real wicked king. And but what happens is the Hellenistic Jews, we get back to them. They were the ones who wanted to sort of integrate with the Greeks, and they liked their culture. And Maccabees talks about how they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom. They removed the marks of circumcision and abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. That's kind of weird, but basically, the Greeks did gymnasium and their sports in the nude. And that's how they could see if you were circumcised or not. And so it's talking about how the Jews, sort of somehow they did something to reverse their circumcision. I don't know how. I think people do it today, though, actually. Yeah, I've heard of that. I've heard of people who reverse their circumcision. So they wanted to look more like Greeks. And so the author of Maccabees is sort of showing this is the origin of the Hellenism. And and that's what and then that's going to lead to the Maccabees, who rise up and say enough, and they're going to stay true to the Jewish faith, but we'll get to that. So it says it grew exceedingly great toward the southeast and toward the glorious land. That's Israel. So he comes into Israel, and it says, verse 10, it grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. Now, what does that mean? Now, this is a passage that sort of gets into, I think, a little bit of the divine council worldview, because it's using host of heaven, which is the angelic leaders. It's talking about the stars being thrown down, right? And stars were thought of as the gods and such, and the gods above were connected to the earthly authorities below. So I think this is a reference to the supernatural spiritual reality behind the earthly events. So it's talking about both of them occurring. It's talking about both the heavenly and the earthly scenarios. And at once, it's talking about the little horn, which is in Epiphanes, and Antiochus. And it says it grows great even to the host of heaven. What does that mean? In other words, he was claiming, what Antiochus Epiphanes did from a Jewish perspective was he was seeking to take the place of God. And not only that, but it says in verse 12, this is where he defiles the temple. The regular burnt offering was taken away, and the place of the sanctuary was overthrown, and a host will be given over it together. So by overthrowing the temple, there's a sense in which that is because the temple of Israel, right, was Yahweh's holy mountain. And the temple was the center and the focus of their religion. And so to the Jew, the heavenly host who were around God's throne were part of that glorious temple, right? So by overthrowing the temple and by destroying the sacrifices, which Book of Maccabees describes that Epiphanes did do, he, it describes how, I'll tell you here in a second, but the basic element here is that because he's overthrowing the temple, stopping the whole sacrificial system, which is the heart and soul, and he's overthrowing it. That's why it's using that star language and the host of heaven. He's literally fighting with God himself. It says he became great, even as great as the prince of the host. Well, who's the prince of the host? Well, this is, again, you can find out, I think it's the angel of Yahweh. Jesus is the prince of the host. He's the angel of Yahweh. Michael is one of the chief angels, but he's not the prince of the host, right? So, and we, again, Heiser goes through that in his book, Angels, and he shows how the difference is there between, some people believe that Michael might be another reference to Jesus as the angel of the Lord, but there's a very distinct, in Daniel, there's a very distinction between that which is probably the angel of the Lord Jesus and Michael. right? Or even, I'm sorry, or even Gabriel, sometimes they think. So there is a distinction there. He makes that distinction. And so basically what this is saying is, by attacking the temple, he is attacking the very prince of the host, right? Because the temple is the house of God, right? So that's the kind of language that you get, just like when you overthrow earthly rulers. If you overthrow the earthly temple, in a sense, that's like you're overthrowing the universe, right?
Well, right. The heavens are shaking, and the moon is
exactly.
turning to blood, and the sun is darkening, and all of that. So
exactly, we've talked about this extensively all throughout Revelation and even a little bit in Daniel here, and Matthew, right? Matthew 24. So yeah, that's what's going on here. It's the language, it's the spiritual language of defiling the temple from their perspective, and how. And by warring against that temple, it's warring against God himself, who is the prince of the host. And it says became great, even as great as. Does that mean it's literal? Oh, you're saying he literally became as great as God? No, again, this is the prophetic language. Of course, he didn't become as great as God, but he sought to. And because he did overthrow that temple and the whole temple system, there was a period of time where they felt like maybe he was, maybe he had overthrown Yahweh himself, until they fought back, right? So let me read a little bit out of Maccabees to give an idea of what he actually did. So he, like I said, he installs. First he does the thing where they build the gymnasium, and he sort of plunders Jerusalem at first. So when he comes up from Egypt, he conquers Egypt. He comes up to Jerusalem. He plunders it. He takes all the utensils out of the temple, out of the gold, and he just plunders it. But then a little bit later, he sends letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah, directed them to follow customs strange to the land, Maccabees says, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices, so there it is, and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, so they weren't allowed to do their festivals. Not only that, but he defiled those festivals. He defiled the sanctuary and the priests. He told them to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols. Sacred precincts are like those sacred groves where they would, high places where you would worship other gods of Canaan. So he's forcing them to do this, and he forced them to build a pagan altar on top of God's holy altar in the temple, right? And then he had them sacrifice pigs on that altar and other unclean animals. And you could not circumcise your sons. They were, so Maccabee says they were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane. So by denying the dietary laws, by denying the laws of sacrifice, by denying the circumcision, he was basically attacking the very covenant of God himself. And this is why Daniel, and particularly God himself, is describing this as, ultimately we're going to see an abomination of desolation, but also in these other phrases, this indignation, let's see if there's anything else about that. Yeah. So Rogers notes this, that so the burnt offerings are taken away and the sanctuary is defiled. So he did this in 2 years later, on the 15th and 25th day of the month of Kislev in 167 BC, Antiochus defiled the temple at Jerusalem by setting up a statue of Jupiter Olympus in the temple and slaughtering a pig in the holy place. So I didn't see that. It must be in a different passage. I didn't see that about the Jupiter Olympus, but yeah. So what happens is 167 BC, 170 is when he sort of starts the whole plundering and all that. But then 167 is when he sends his army there and forces them to defile the sanctuary. He doesn't destroy it, but he just defiles it. So that's why 167 BC is a key date for Israel's history. And it's one that the fulfillment is not in the scriptures, but it is in Maccabees. So you could read about it there. Very, very interesting. Yeah. So defiling the altar and such. And then it's really kind of cool, because then what happens is there's this priest named Mattathias, and he has 5 sons: Simeon, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar. And Judas, called Maccabeus, he was the warrior guy. He's the one who ultimately ends up raising an army. They they stand up and they kill the Jews who were following the sacrifice. They kill all the Greeks who were there in the city of Jerusalem, and they said no more. They destroyed all the idolatry. They tore down the altar remember how I said that the Gentiles built an altar on top of God's altar, right? So what Judas did was they basically fought back and took back Jerusalem, which then caused Antiochus to send his armies to fight them, and he lost. So, but what happened was, to them, the altar was so holy because the altar was supposed to be built by stones that were unhewn by human hands. So it was basically finding stones and finding ones that fit and work. So it's kind of a rough altar, right? But what happened was, because Antiochus had built a pagan altar on top of it, they considered the altar itself defiled. So when they tore it down, they literally took the rocks of the original temple, because they were defiled by the Greek stuff, and they put it in a special location, but they didn't use it, and they rebuilt a new temple with unhewn rocks. That's how they were trying to return back to the holiness of what God had called them to. And that's why this whole notion that we're going to see in Daniel 9 about the abomination of desolation, why it's so important. This abomination, it means it's a defiling of the holy place and the holiness of God himself. And in verse 14, he concludes by saying, let's see if I skipped anything else. Oh, let's jump down. Remember I said the little horn, he grew great. It said that, even as great as the Prince of Hosts, and that idea of the willful king imagery. Well, down in verse 23, he defines this as a king of bold face, verse 23. This is Antiochus Epiphanes, or other translations say king of fierce countenance. And I just thought that was kind of a interesting, again, this willful king, or the king of fierce countenance. And later on, when it says when it's explaining the interpretation of verse 25, that he shall rise up against the Prince of Princes. Oh, there it is again. It says he shall be broken, but not by human hand. What does that mean? Well, that means God kills him. And as a matter of fact, in First Maccabees, according to First Maccabees, there's a little bit of legendariness to it, but it's what we have. Antiochus dies in a fit of melancholy in 164 BC. After having repented of his mistreatment of Jerusalem and the Jews. He says, "This I am convinced is why these misfortunes have overtaken me, and why I am dying of melancholy in a foreign land." So Epiphanes had gone on to conquer other places, and he ended up dying while he was away from his homeland, right, of some sickness. But the Jews who are writing Maccabees, excuse me. They describe it as like, oh, he's sorry for it, and he realizes, oh, I'm dying of melancholy. Who knows how he really died? But the point here is that he was broken by God. He was killed by God, not by human hands, as part of his punishment. But finishing this up, though, back in verse 14, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. Interesting. So 2,300 evenings and mornings, that comes out to about exactly 6 years and 3.5 months. And this was the time during which Antiochus occupied the city of Jerusalem. And J. Rogers writes about, although the Jews were oppressed for over 6 years under the tyranny of Antiochus, for the last 3 years of the occupation, the sacrifices ceased to be offered. That's when he ceased them to be offered, like it's saying here. And the purifying of the temple was not at the end of the 6th year, but not until the 9th month of the Jewish year, November, December, which is also the 3rd month of the Jewish civil year. So in other words, it was 2,300 evenings and mornings before the sanctuary was rightfully restored to its place by the Maccabean brothers and the Maccabean revolt. And here's what it says in 1 Maccabees 4, verse 52. Early in the morning on the 12th day of the 9th month, the 140th year, they rose and offered sacrifice as the law directs on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built, like I told you, right? And at the very season, on the very day, that the Gentiles had profaned it. And then just something else that's historically interesting. Josephus writes of this same event in Antiquities 10:11:7. He writes, and indeed it so came to pass. He's talking about Daniel's prophecy. And indeed it came to pass that our nation suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes according to Daniel's vision and what he wrote many years before they came to pass. Now it's interesting because when the angel is explaining the vision here, the last thing he says is verse 26, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And what we get here is Antiochus came 370 years after Daniel's death. So I was wrong. Earlier I said, what did I say?
I don't remember.
Oh, no, I was talking about from Alexander to Antiochus. I'm terrible with years, folks. So if I screw up the years, just have some grace and look it up and correct it for yourself.
Well, it's not like it's not like we're talking about the 80s here, man. We're talking like 2,500 years plus.
I'm always terrible with these years, unless it's something very specific, like the 40 years, right? But it's just like, guys like Jay Rogers, man, that guy, like, he like knows the history up and down. So it's a great book. But in terms of Daniel's prophecy, Antiochus came 370 years later. So we talked about this in the book of Revelation. And that is that when a prophecy is not going to be fulfilled near in a short time, in a short period of time, this is the language that's used. Seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. So this actually came to fulfillment 370 years later. So if it's going to be several hundred years later, you seal up the vision, which is interesting because when we get to Revelation, after he gives the whole revelation, the angels or Jesus is explaining it to him. He says, do not seal up the words of the prophecy, for the time is near. So this is, again, one of these preterist things that really hits hard on the futurist paradigm, because they try to redefine things. Oh, time is near just means it's imminent. It could happen at any moment for thousands of years, which is a nonsensical saying if you think about it. That doesn't mean anything. It could happen at any moment for thousands of years. Well, that means it's not near at all. That's not what near means. And it never means that anywhere in the biblical text. But
it never means that in any language. It doesn't mean that in any language ever throughout history. That's not how any version of the word near is used. Ever. Yeah.
In fact, it's not even how the modern prophecy pundits mean it. When they say the second coming of Jesus is near, the rapture is near, they mean it's literally within our lifetimes, right? Even they use that concept themselves in that way.
To be fair, we have that one really bad argument that a day is but 1,000 years to the Lord. And so it's soon to God, right?
Right. But my point is this is why I love it when we see actual biblical examples that show you when the language is used to seal it up, it refers to at least hundreds of years from now. So if they're not saying sealing it up because it's near, then it's going to happen certainly within the lifetime of those listening, So at least our argument is based on actual scripture rather than just saying, well, if a day is 1,000 years, then I'll just apply it arbitrarily wherever I need it to be that. And that doesn't fit. Where are we? Okay. So I addressed that. I think that's about it. So, we went through the explanation and we ended with the sealing up of the vision. So that's, that pretty much concludes this chapter. And like I said, it's mostly uncontroversial. I think most people agree these are the characters that are there. And so the next episode we're going to talk about Daniel 9, and Daniel 9 is a major Bible prophecy. I would probably say this, the prophecy of the 70 weeks could very well be one of the most crucial prophecies in all of Scripture because of how it even affected the Jews, and we'll talk about that when we talk about it next episode. Yeah, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I guess I kind of have a question. When I was reading this chapter again, read it a couple times, I guess I noticed something I never noticed, and that was at the very end, after the angel of the Lord explains these things to Daniel. It goes through point by point, right? Kingdoms, this is
Okay.
what it means, blah, blah, blah. Even Daniel
Yeah.
said he lay there sick for some days, and he arose and he went about the king's business. This is in verse 27. Then I arose and went about the king's business, and I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. And I guess maybe I'm just looking at this, maybe I'm just too simple in the mind as I'm reading this, but even after it's thoroughly explained to Daniel, he's still confused by it. And I don't know. I was going to ask you what you thought about that. Like, immediately after the explanation, he's still confused. So was he seeing these things and still didn't understand their full meaning? It seems to indicate he still didn't completely understand the full meaning here. Was he confused as to when these things were to come to pass? Or, what do you think?
He says, I was appalled by the vision. What is it? He was appalled. I'm appalled by this
That's
vision.
what
Honestly, I don't know.
That sentence just struck me as interesting because it showed a response which I didn't anticipate, because you're right. He was appalled by it. Anyway, what are your thoughts?
Well, my initial reaction is just that, like you say, so much of this is complex. And imagine this, imagine you're seeing, like, who knows, did he just see it symbolically, or did he see a vision and he describes it symbolically? But if you just take it on a face value, he's seeing this stuff, and maybe he has a sense of, you can read this and have a sense of, oh, then this king's going to come and he does this and this, but it still is confusing if you don't really know a historical character and exactly what the things are that he does. I could see having a certain amount of confusion. In other words, you can understand the sensibility of the story within the vision, but the confusion would come. But what does it really look like historically? I don't know, because he's not gonna. He doesn't.
It brought me a certain degree of comfort, though, because I realized when God specifically revealed this to Daniel, he wakes up and even Daniel was like, what? What?
Yeah.
And so for those that are studying this, it's okay if you have the what moment as you read this. Well, so did Daniel. So take heart.
Amen.
Take heart. Guys, I put a link in the comments to Jay's book, which is not something I did for Ken Gentry's commentary because it's not out and available yet. And I realized on the first two episodes that I didn't even have a link to his book, which is what we were referencing. So in the comments of both the last two videos plus this one, you're going to find links to Lulu and Amazon where you can get the paperback or you can buy the ebook. If you want to explore this as we go through it, feel free. It is there for you. Brian's information and all our information, it's available in the comment section right beneath the video. So guys, thanks for watching as we tackle Daniel chapter 8. We'll check out Daniel chapter 9 next time. Brian, where can they find all your stuff?
Good point. Yeah, I've actually written quite a bit on prophecy. I've got a book called End Times Bible Prophecy. I've got a series of novels that you may have seen the ads on this podcast for, Chronicles of the Apocalypse, and it talks about the true story of the book of Revelation, but written with a fictional element to show the angels and demons and all the spiritual warfare type of thing. And but I also have a course that I put all the stuff that I've written and communicating about Bible prophecy. I put it in a course called "Are We Living in the Last Days?" You can find all this information at my website, godawa.com, GODAWA.com, where you can find like that if you want to find that online course and get everything I've written at once type of thing. Or you just go to Amazon. All my books are in audio, paperback, and ebook on Amazon. So you can go there.
Guys, and don't forget, these videos have been sponsored by Al, our friend at MovitaOils.com. If you guys use the promo code TTB20 at checkout, you'll get any CBD product in any quantity that you ordered 20% off, and you can use that promo code forever because it's a lifetime promo code. So if you already buy CBD, save some money, buy it from Al. He helps us out, and we're proud to have him as a sponsor. So, hey, Brian, thanks for hanging out. This was Daniel chapter 8. We'll be back with Daniel chapter 9. We love you guys. Peace.